Oh god. Oh, here we go. My name is Abby, and if it's not super obvious by my lack of an internet footprint, I have never done this before. I've always thought about doing video essays because I always really liked long-form YouTube content, but as someone who would be starting out as like completely an internet rando, it felt more than a little unhinged to just spew my thoughts onto the internet with no regard for anyone else's opinion or if anyone cared. But then I got COVID and I was stuck in this room for 10 full days, and I was wondering like how I should spend my time, what kind of movies I should be watching. Am I writing the screenplays that I've been putting off for the last 8 years? No. I wanted to watch every movie in the Snyderverse because I'd never seen any of the DC Zack Snyder superhero movies, and I was like, you know what, I haven't seen any of them, I've been a hater for too long, maybe I should just like go through them. And I was first inspired to think about it more critically when I was watching this Corridor Crew video about how they were comparing the two different types of CGI in the Justice League version 1, which they released in 2017, and the Justice League version 2 that they released on HBO. It's called the Snyder Cut. It's like 4 hours long. There was really a lot to be learned about filmmaking and about what it meant to have a lot of studio oversight, what it meant to have two different directors finishing up different projects at different speeds, and how that affected the final product. I also thought it might be interesting to compare both versions of Justice League to the Avengers, and while I will get more into this, Joss Whedon, the director of the Avengers, was hired to basically finish up the direction of the Justice League, so I thought it might be interesting to think about, you know, what he might have taken from that major success and how the interaction between those very different styles might have caused some sort of massive fallout and terrible ratings or something like that. I don't know, I'm not like a genius or anything. And I also thought that in comparing the Avengers to the Justice League, I could talk about the direction that the MCU and DCEU have taken and how their different styles and different methods of franchise building have resulted in two very different public opinions of them. I should say that this is by no means a comprehensive comparison of the two universes because that video would be 8 hours long, and thankfully I was not in my room for 8 months, and I do have a real person job occasionally. So I wanted to do something that was like a little more contained but still way longer than it had to be because I've always been way too verbose, to put it lightly. So first, I thought I should go into the story of how these two movies were made. From what I can tell, Zack Snyder essentially came up with a plan for the DCEU. It was meant to be different from the MCU because instead of starting with a lot of solo films, essentially he's making crossover films to introduce characters and then exploring more of their characters' arcs in separate films outside of the crossovers. And this does not include Man of Steel, which I consider to be more of like a pilot for the universe. Snyder was originally planning to make the first few films like Man of Steel or Batman vs. Superman much darker, but then the films would get a lot lighter in tone as the universe developed. And then Justice League was about a month from shooting when the reviews for Batman vs. Superman started rolling in and the people did not like it. And suddenly the studio wanted to make everything happier, funnier, and they wanted to make the movie less than 2 hours long. The studio then hired Avengers director Joss Whedon to do some extensive rewrites and to help out with reshoots. Snyder originally planned to direct the reshoots, but due to a personal tragedy, he had to drop out of the film, leaving Whedon to essentially direct the reshoots and finish up the cut of the movie himself. I always thought this was so interesting because I feel like Joss Whedon seemed like such an obvious choice for a big superhero team-up movie that was happy and funny, and then it went so wrong. So my main questions going into this are, why did it go so poorly? What does this whole garbage fire say about studio oversight and making these huge cinematic blockbusters under a cinematic universe umbrella? I also want to think about the differences between the two Justice Leagues and what that says about two very different directorial styles. And I also wanted to think a little bit about the DCEU as a whole and why it was never really quite able to catch up with Marvel in terms of popularity. So I'll try to be impartial, but I do think that it's important to note what kind of like insane foaming at the mouth fervor that DC was going up against, because Man of Steel came out about 2 years after the Avengers, and I was online and already a nerd by then, so I remember how crazy it was. By the time Avengers came out, Marvel had spent literally 10 years getting me to care about Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, and seeing them all together in one movie was actually mind-blowing to me. So trying to make Justice League come even close to matching that hype would have been a little hard. But that being said, I did want to give Justice League a fair shake. I'd seen both of Zack Snyder's zombie movies, which I thought were pretty fun, but I hadn't really seen anything else he'd done. And I thought it would be a little unfair to watch Justice League totally in the dark without forming any kind of connection to the characters that he had worked so hard to finally have team up in this movie. And I felt like Man of Steel would be a lot like Iron Man in the way that they were introducing their marketable characters to their audience within a world that other marketable characters will soon exist in, and trying to generate audience hype. So this movie was a lot different than anything I'd seen from Marvel, which honestly I think was a pretty good choice. Marvel movies, especially early on, tended to follow the exact same structure. The hero would discover or get their powers in Act 1, reckon with them in Act 2, and then Act 3 would just be like a final boss fight. Already, the scale of Man of Steel seems way more epic than something like Iron Man, because they're already dealing with a world-ending threat. And in terms of setting the tone for the universe and establishing our first recognizable face in Superman, I think the movie does a pretty good job. So after Krypton explodes and we learn maybe a little too many times that our villain Zod will be back to find Superman.
You believe your son is safe? I will find him. I will find him. I will find him. I will find him!
Clark is sent to Earth to be raised by humans. We see him kind of running around and anonymously helping people, and we get a bunch of flashbacks to his childhood. We meet Lois Lane in the Arctic, where she is reporting on the government finding an ancient alien spaceship in the ice. She sneaks out and interrupts Clark while he's getting an exposition ex machina from a hologram of his dead father. He ends up having to save her and reveal his powers. She discovers that Superman is Clark Kent, and he convinces her to shut up about it, right before Zod and his evil crew come to basically destroy the world and make it a new Krypton. He obviously saves the world. He starts working at the Daily Planet, and he and Lois make flirty eye contact and cut to black. So, my thoughts on this movie. The action is a little insane. I could see how watching a lot of this on a big screen might make my eyes bleed, but it really feels like Snyder had a really specific plan for his action scenes, and he knows exactly what's gonna look really cool. Like, for example, I think this cut is sick, but then it pans over to reveal a bunch of people just like looking at Lois and Clark having this moment, which I thought was pretty silly, but you know, you can't win them all. I liked how you can also really see how indestructible and strong the characters are because they're destroying everything in their path when they fight. I also like that they didn't go chronologically through Superman's origin story because we know exactly what happens, and it makes the plot structure a little less predictable. The dialogue is a little show don't tell at times.
Harry, come on, it's me we're talking about. I'm a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter.
Then act like it.
Like, I was always taught it was more natural to have other characters volunteer information about your main characters. Like, her boss could have just said, oh, if I print this, you'll be a joke and your Pulitzer won't mean shit anymore. And that would have made a lot more sense and sounded a lot less screenplay-y. I honestly think they were right to make the movie almost a little over-serious, because at the end of the day, a flying guy who shoots lasers out of his eyes is just kind of a crazy, fantastical concept. And we also know from past movies that it can get really campy really quickly. That being said, it just didn't work for me as well as a lot of Marvel movies do. Personally, I just feel like superhero stories are a little crazy and silly anyway, and I just have a lot easier time buying it if it's a story like Guardians of the Galaxy, which is like crazy, silly space aliens instead of somber, serious space aliens.
Come and get your love. Come and get your... Oh, yeah. Hey.
So he's an idiot.
Yeah.
My suspension of disbelief in comedies is just a little higher because I know that the movie isn't taking itself too seriously. And I felt like a lot of moments in this film were taking themselves way too seriously for what they were. Like in Clark's backstory, I don't know how many random disasters can happen to a person to make them almost reveal their crazy supernatural powers. It just seemed like low-hanging fruit for a parody movie, which didn't bode well for like a morose story about the responsibilities of godlike power. Also, whenever Superman is doing something that pushes the limits of his strength, he just yells really hard and then does whatever he needs to do, which I also thought was kind of silly. I also thought that it was a little weird that they did so much exposition for why Clark was so strong.
Earth's sun is younger and brighter than Krypton's was. Your cells have drunk in its radiation, strengthening your muscles, your skin, your senses. Earth's gravity is weaker, yet its atmosphere is more nourishing.
But if we're explaining that, why is Superman's alter ego just Clark Kent with glasses? I also found it pretty hard to connect with Clark as a main character. Like, I get that he's supposed to be godly and contemplative, but some of this shit just did not work for me.
I have so many questions. Where do I come from? Why did you send me here?
Like, I don't blame the acting here. I think it kind of has to be like this. But if you're telling this kind of story and specifically trying not to be funny, I think it comes off a little weird. As a side note, something that also came off a little weird was the one joke I recognized in the entire movie.
You know, they say it's all downhill after the first kiss.
I'm pretty sure that only counts when you're kissing a human.
I much prefer this joke when he gets smashed into one of those workplace incident tracker signs. At the end of the day, I think that the film is good for what it is, and I learned in the credits that Christopher Nolan got a story credit, which makes a lot of sense. He updated Batman for the 21st century by giving him a brooding makeover, and I can tell that they're trying to do the same thing with Superman. His story is just so ridiculous from the beginning that I feel like they might be trying the impossible. Okay, so that was Superman, but I was left with so many questions from this film. Like, how were they gonna keep setting up the DCEU if Metropolis was literally destroyed? How do they set up other heroes like Batman if he's not even getting his own movie until after the Justice League? Unfortunately, all of those questions were answered years ago, and I could learn all the information I needed for myself. It just took me a while to come to terms with how. So the only version of this movie on HBO Max was the Ultimate Edition, which was like 3 hours long, so here we go. The film opens with a montage of Batman's origin story, and then we cut straight to Bruce Wayne's on-the-ground perspective when Superman is fighting Zod in Metropolis. He sees all the destruction firsthand and becomes a Superman hater. So without going too much into it, Lex Luthor is trying to get Batman to fight Superman, so he runs a huge smear campaign against Superman. He's also trying to manipulate a congresswoman to give him Zod's body, Zod's old ship, and some kryptonite that was found in the Indian Ocean, all ostensibly to fight Superman. There's also this huge hearing at the midpoint of the movie that he just blows up. There are all these supporting characters that we've been following, and they all just instantly die, which I thought was really surprising and cool. So Lex Luthor makes a monster with the Kryptonian ship, and once Batman and Superman have decided to be friends and not enemies, which takes about 5 lines of dialogue, they team up with Wonder Woman to fight said monster. Superman dies, and his funeral takes 15 minutes, even though we know that he'll be in the next movie, and cut to black. There were a lot of things I liked about this movie. I was thinking a lot about franchise building and how they were introducing Batman, even though he didn't get his own movie, and I thought they did a really good job. Snyder knows that no one wants to spend any more time on Batman's origin story, so good for him. We don't really get any of these crazy shots of his estate like we do in a lot of other Batman movies because, again, Snyder knows that we don't care, we know he's rich. We can also tell that he's already fought the Joker. I like how they show that Batman is good at fighting because he is unpredictable. Although about 5 minutes later, he just burst through another wall, and that was predictable. I like that we got this distinction between Batman and Superman being two very different types of heroes, because while Batman is on the ground beating the shit out of sex traffickers, Superman is like saving people from fires and stuff. It's also clear that Superman is incredibly, frustratingly overpowered. Like, there's this one scene where we see Batman's car crashing through other cars, walls, everything, and then Superman almost folds it in half just by standing in its way. Superman, I still couldn't connect with. There's this scene at the beginning I thought was really cute, where Lois is worried that their relationship is gonna be doomed, and Clark gets in the tub with her with all his clothes on. It was giving me a little too much manic pixie energy. Clark, you know, he needs some advice sometimes, but he never falters in his mission to just be the best boy he can. And I totally get how you could just come for Captain America with the same criticism, but, you know, at least Cap is funny. There wasn't much for Wonder Woman to do, except tell the audience of Batman vs. Superman that there was going to be a Wonder Woman movie, and she did that, so good for her. Lex Luthor also gets this kind of funny Zuckerberg makeover. He does have some great campy moments. Like, I thought it was great when he puts candy in this guy's mouth. And then when he kidnaps Superman's mom, it's clear that he's living for the power that he has over Superman, but then he has to ruin it by being overly literal.
And now God bends to my will.
And it kind of feels like they're trying to match Heath Ledger's Joker with the chaotic energy, but he's just so annoying.
Laying low in the morning. Low line slacks. Lois Lane. Come see the view.
I also like the action way better than Man of Steel. It feels a little less overly frenetic, and there are still those moments where you can tell someone was just so pumped to think about this when they were storyboarding, and I always think that's pretty cool. But at the end of the day, it is still just so long and angsty. Like, Lex Luthor has this "the night I've planned is finally here" moment, and the final fight starts fully an hour and 15 minutes before the end of the movie. But at the end of the day, I think that this was a good introduction to Batman and at least the idea of the Justice League. It's still a pretty good movie and a good spectacle, but I think it was just a really hard task to ask us to care about these characters as much as we might have cared about another hero versus hero story like Captain America Civil War, because we've just spent so much more time with a character like Captain America, or especially Iron Man. And although the villain in Civil War, like Lex Luthor, goes to this insane, unnecessary effort to get Tony and Cap to fight each other, I felt that linking their conflict to either protecting or avenging not only someone they loved, but also characters that the audience was familiar with worked a lot better. Okay. Now that I'm finally caught up with the DCEU, I feel ready to do the thing I said I was gonna do like 20 minutes ago. I understand where we left off with all these characters, and I have a pretty good idea of how they act. I also feel like I have a pretty good idea of the tone of the universe, but I wanted to start my discussion with the movie that made Warner Brothers think Whedon could even fix Justice League in the first place. I feel like everyone in the world knows this story, but just in case, really quickly. After Thor's brother Loki takes a magic power cube, Nick Fury gathers his team with the help of Phil Coulson. The team flounders, but after Loki gets the better of them and kills Coulson, they agree to work together and fight him in New York by closing a portal he's made so that a hostile alien race cannot take over, and they win, and roll credits, hooray. And after all these DC movies, I was like, maybe I've been hating on DC so much. Maybe Marvel isn't really that good. But no, it still slaps. I mean, there are some silly plot holes, and obviously Joss Whedon is a little bit weird about Black Widow, but I can understand why Warner Brothers thought Joss Whedon was a really good pick to turn Justice League into a giant cash cow. I'll get into most of my analysis later, and hopefully I'll be able to figure out why he wasn't. But first... This movie is a monstrosity, but at the end of the day, I guess it's not as terrible as it could have been. Like, is it cringe? Yes. Is it funny? Not the way it's supposed to be. But Zack Snyder's version of this movie is 4 hours long. Given the fact that they cut half of it and it still makes sense at all is pretty impressive. And just the fact that the CGI fights are even comprehensible is such a testament to the power of VFX artists. Basically, the plot is Batman is trying to get a team of people together because Superman is dead now. Wonder Woman joins him pretty early, and they recruit, with varying success, Aquaman, The Flash, and Cyborg. They then have to fight generic, world-destroying villain Steppenwolf, who is trying to find magical boxes that, when put together, will destroy the world. They resurrect Superman because they don't think they can beat Steppenwolf alone, but he fucks off to hang out with his mom and Lois until he comes back to save the day at the last minute. The team has a final fight in Russia, and Superman comes back and beats the shit out of Steppenwolf, and they win. Hooray. And now, very quickly, oh my god. I just have to reiterate that this movie is 4 hours long. It has basically the same plot, but it makes a little more sense why the characters come together when they do and act the way they act. For example, when Steppenwolf steals his first magic box from the Amazonians, they send a plea for Wonder Woman to help them. She sees that plea, does some investigating, and learns about Steppenwolf, which they totally cut out of the first version, where she just goes to talk to Bruce and knows everything about Steppenwolf instantly. We also get a more clear explanation of why Batman is so intent on getting a team together. It's just more clear that he knows there are greater threats on the way now that Superman is dead. Wonder Woman just proves him right when she comes to him with everything she knows about Steppenwolf. Also, in version 1, we get just the most nebulous version ever about what these magic cubes are, but we do get a little more exposition in version 2 so they don't feel just like infinity cubes. One important thing that wasn't clear to me at all in version 1 is that Steppenwolf can only sense the magic boxes when they're activated, which explains why he doesn't go after the mother box that's literally in Cyborg's closet until after they resurrect Superman. It's one of those things that honestly they might have said it, but the movie was just racing forward at such a crazy pace that I didn't even process it. We also learn in this version that Steppenwolf is just a little pawn trying to get his space daddy Darkseid to love him again, which both sets up a bigger, badder villain for future Justice League / superhero team-up movies and makes Steppenwolf a lot less generic. Now I want to break my analysis up into several parts, because I don't really know how else to go at it. I'm essentially considering Justice League version 2 more of the true spiritual successor to the universe, and Justice League version 1 was essentially more a studio coming in and trying to remake the Avengers because they love money. That means when I talk about the Avengers, I'm mainly going to try to think about how it compares to Justice League both as a film and as part of a franchise. I also want to focus on what the studio and Whedon took from the Avengers when they were making version 1. On top of all that, I want to do a little bit of hypothesizing as to why the Avengers was so much better received. I feel like Cyborg, who, because of his connection to the magic boxes, has all the information in the universe at his fingertips. He just needs to figure out how to parse it. Let's get into it. So we know that Snyder's vision for the DCEU was that it was supposed to start out pretty dark and over time grow more hopeful as they introduced characters who brought a lighter tone to their films, like The Flash and the manliest man's man of all, Aquaman.
You're welcome. A man.
But then the studio came in after it was almost finished and said, no, we need it to be funny now. So they made the color palette a lot brighter. They put a new score in, so there's kind of this hokey music playing underneath all the action to make it like a fun superhero film. The first bank heist scene with Wonder Woman almost felt like a cartoon to me.
Who are you?
So in comes Whedon to make it funnier. And the comedy is bad. Like other elements of the movie, I won't blame Joss Whedon for, but whoever wrote some of these jokes does need to pay for their crimes.
Clark promised me you were going to bring home another Pulitzer.
Oh, did he?
Oh, yes, he did. He said that you were the thirstiest young woman he ever met. Hungriest.
And it was honestly surprising to me how bad some of these jokes were, because I love the comedy in the Avengers, and I could see why Warner Brothers thought that Joss Whedon would be a shoo-in to make another action comedy hit. I at least know that Tumblr in 2012 could absolutely not get enough of his jokes. In contrast to the thirsty joke, which was super awkward and out of character, here's a joke from the Avengers that I remember getting a really big laugh.
I'd like to know how Loki used it to turn 2 of the sharpest men I know into his personal flying monkeys.
Monkeys. I do not understand.
I do. I understood that reference.
This joke works because of what we know, that Cap has been in the ice for 80 years and has missed out on a lot. When someone makes a reference that he is actually old enough to understand, and he just is happy to feel included. Here's another one with Phil Coulson.
It was quite the buzz around here, finding you in the ice. Thought Coulson was gonna swoon. Did he ask you to sign his Captain America trading cards yet?
Trading cards?
They're vintage. He's very proud.
Then later, we cut straight into this conversation.
I mean, if it's not too much trouble.
No, it's fine.
It's a vintage set. Took me a couple of years to collect them all. Near mint.
Then we get some physical comedy that I remember cracking up at because it shows that Coulson really idolizes Cap in a really funny, awkward way. And later, this joke becomes more meaningful when Fury uses the trading cards as a symbol of how Coulson died believing in heroes. It's a great thematic element that started out as a funny joke and came full circle. There are some lines that are a little cringier, but for the most part, the jokes hit. Basically, the film is really good at finding comedy in every scene.
How will your friends have time for me when they're so busy fighting you?
It's usually actually works.
And it feels like every joke is either motivated by the plot, the action, or the way the characters interact with their world. Justice League version 1, on the other hand, does not have a lot to work with. The only actor that feels like they're trying to have fun is Jason Momoa, and Ezra Miller seems like the only actor that's actually having fun. Batman is giving off little funny quips now, which feels super antithetical to his character.
You want to protect them, you need to work with me. Strong man is strongest alone. You ever heard that?
That's not a saying. That's the opposite of what the saying is.
I think Ben Affleck is doing the best that he can, but Bruce Wayne is just a reserved, profoundly unfunny guy, and I don't say that to roast him. A character like Tony Stark, on the other hand, is witty in-universe. His silly quips are funny because you feel like he knows he's telling a joke.
Batman is playing Galaga. Thought we wouldn't notice, but we did.
Here's another example of some comedy from the rewrites.
I've been a loner my whole life, but being part of something bigger like this, maybe I'm scared because I'm meant to.
I think that was beautiful.
You say a word about this, or you'll meet every piranha I know.
We have this whole monologue from Aquaman. The reveal that Wonder Woman is compelling him to tell the truth feels awkward, and it's shot in such a way that it almost feels like an afterthought. Wonder Woman is not funny, and she's not a trickster, so it really doesn't feel like anything her character would do. With a lot of these rewritten jokes, I understand that there's no real way to do an elaborate system of setup and payoff if most of the movie has already been filmed, but a lot of the jokes just kind of felt like they were a first draft, and everyone was acting so out of character that it was super jarring. There are some jokes that I recall working, not in like a funny ha-ha way, but just that they got a little chuckle out of me.
So let me get this straight. You do address like a bat, like an actual bat.
A lot of these I realized later that they were actually in the Snyder Cut already.
What are your superpowers again?
I'm rich.
Like here, Batman isn't really trying to tell a joke. It feels like from his perspective, he's just stating a fact, but the way that the character does it is funny. Most of the comedy in the Snyder Cut comes from the lighter-hearted characters, which I think was a really good call. That way, Lois doesn't have to be funny. She can just mourn Clark. I also thought that the Flash was really funny and a good addition to the team.
Silica-based sand quartz fabric. Abrasion resistant, heat resistant.
Yeah, I do competitive ice dancing.
It's what they use on the space shuttle to prevent it from burning up on re-entry.
I do very competitive ice dancing.
This works a lot better for me because he's a much sillier character. And they're not trying to make him do dastardly wordplay. Most of the stuff he said is awkward just because he's an awkward kid. He's just kind of a disaster and interacts with the world in a really funny way.
Oh gosh, I hope everyone's okay.
See, in times of crisis, for dog work, I always bring a meat snack because it makes them feel calm, because you never know what's gonna happen in this city. I mean, oh my gosh, right? I start on Monday?
I do have to admit, there were some jokes that I originally roasted for being bad rewrites.
You must be Barry. I'm Diana.
Hi, Barry, I'm Diana. That's not right.
And then was surprised to find out that they were also in the Snyder Cut, so I guess they were supposed to be there the whole time. Anyway, the Snyder Cut seems to understand that this is not a universe for quippy jokes. Adding them into rewrites just led to this awful tonal inconsistency with characters like Batman, Wonder Woman, and especially Superman, who are by nature kind of godly and introspective and now have to be funny and witty. Like, this version of Clark Kent has never once told a joke, and I know that for sure because I've seen all of his movies. What I'm trying to say is that the Snyder version was funny enough. Whether or not you like Marvel movies better, I think that it's really clear that these are not Marvel characters, and trying to make them act that way led to some really bad comedy. Okay, now on to my next major critique that I really can't blame Whedon at all for. So we know that the studio didn't want Justice League to be more than 2 hours long. And to me, the fact that Snyder's version was 4 hours and Whedon's version was literally exactly 2 hours long makes me think that they were cutting literally everything they could to make the movie that short and still understandable at all. So honestly, I can't really even blame Whedon for none of this shit making any sense, because it does really feel like they cut out everything that they could, which meant that they also cut out a lot of really important character beats that maybe didn't further the plot immediately, but also explained why everyone was acting why the hell they were acting all the time. So, starting with the villain, Steppenwolf felt like such a non-character in version 1. Honestly, I don't know how his redesign managed to make him seem both more human-like and less expressive. Like, when he was getting yelled at by Darkseid in version 2, his eyebrows gave me the vibe of like a very sad dog, and I almost felt bad for him. And also, all of the exposition for Steppenwolf's motivations were completely cut out of version 1. It's something that I understand why they might have had to cut it, but without Steppenwolf's connection to Darkseid, who's basically like Uber Thanos, I guess. He just seems like the most generically evil, motivationless villain I think I have ever seen. I also feel like the film lost so much in version 1 by cutting out so much of Cyborg's arc, because his story ended up being one of the, if not the most important emotional core of version 2. In my opinion, his story promotes him from being a supporting character to a lead, because honestly, he has more to do than Wonder Woman. In version 1, we learn that he has daddy issues, but that's pretty much it. But in version 2, we get this entire plot line where he starts out feeling like a total monster and blaming his distant father who saved him for his situation. His dad gives him a tape recorder since Cyborg will not speak to him. He listens to it enough to learn some exposition about the origin and scope of his powers, but he breaks it as soon as his dad says he's about to get emotional because he's not ready to hear what his dad has to say. But, you know, throughout the film, they almost seem like they're on a path to mend their relationship. His dad shows that he trusts him. He even overrides protocol where he works to allow Cyborg and his super friends access to the Kryptonian ship, eventually sacrificing himself so that the team can track the last magic cube back to their climactic fight. If that didn't make any sense, don't worry, it's not relevant. But by the end of the story, we have Cyborg accepting himself not as a monster, but as a hero who helped save the world. He spends his entire story essentially wishing he had died, but at the end he refuses what looks like an opportunity to join his parents in death because he realizes that he's not done helping the real world. I also thought it was a nice touch that we see how he visualizes himself in his imagination several times, but it isn't until the end that he's truly seeing himself as how he is now. And I thought that was like a really subtle, nice character moment. And then at the end of the story, we pay off the tape because he fixes it and listens to his now dead father saying how proud of him he is, which then turns into a voiceover about generally being a force for good that wraps up the film. Honestly, at the end of the day, I really believe that every good movie is just a really elaborate series of setups and payoffs, and along with most of his scenes, both the setup and the payoff of the tape recorder are taken out of version 1, which robs him of the plot device that's emblematic of his character growth. I think the Avengers does setup and payoff really well. The most obvious example of this is one of the emotional cores of the film, which is Tony realizing that sometimes being a hero takes sacrifice. So it starts off when Tony is arguing with Cap. He calls Cap naive and a little square for thinking that sometimes there isn't a way out. But when we hear it the first time, it just sounds like they're arguing. And then we pay it off in the climax of the movie when Tony uses the last of his super suit power to fly a nuke into space. This is the lesson that he learns, that sometimes there's no way out. He's gonna fly this nuke into space and he doesn't know if he can come back. Even though obviously we're pretty positive that he's gonna live. It's a powerful moment because we know that Tony has realized that he's at the end of his line, but he still decides to make the sacrifice without knowing whether or not he's gonna win the fight. So I think one of the main reasons why the first version of Justice League feels so strange is that they didn't have time to set anything up, so all of the payoff moments feel totally out of the blue. So early in the film, we understand that Cyborg is surprised to learn that his arm becomes a blaster when he feels like he's in danger. We're reminded of it very subtly later. And then after they resurrect Superman, it pays off because his arm recognizes that Superman is a danger. He fires his blaster at Superman, antagonizing him and starting this big fight. And in Whedon's version of Justice League, we only get the third beat, which we need for the fight to happen, but without the first two beats setting it up, it just feels totally cheap and out of the blue. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that that moment felt really cheap from a plotting perspective, but also without the setup and payoff of Cyborg's emotional journey, his characterization just feels pretty cheap as well. It really feels like they had so much to do, but some of the studio powers that be insisted on cutting so much runtime that the movie just felt hollow. Also, just really quickly, while we were talking about characterization, I thought it was important to mention how badly Whedon needed all of us to know that Wonder Woman and Batman are gonna fuck one day, but the way they go about it is just like so 2000s rom-com.
What about, Diana?
Well, you have her number.
I'm only interested in her skill set.
I'm sure you are.
Can we?
Oh, like this guy doesn't get laid. And the actors have I want to say negative chemistry. Like, I accidentally scrubbed forward when I was watching version 1 and peeked ahead at a scene where Batman is undressing and Wonder Woman comes to like massage him, and I literally took a nap because I wanted to procrastinate watching it. Batman and Wonder Woman only had one kind of silly moment in version 2, which I think worked a lot better.
And if we're gonna do this, you're gonna need to be open to more things that we have. You know.
I'm sorry. That's okay.
Don't worry about it. It happens.
So,
I think that Snyder seems to understand that we don't buy Batman and Wonder Woman as romantic leads yet. At best, they're like friendly colleagues who've seen each other for 5 minutes. It's more of a hint of a potential romance, and I think that Bruce would be awkward about touching Diana's hand because he's not stupid and he can tell when someone's out of his league. But it just feels less forced because they're trying to do less. What kind of blew my mind is that there were 7 scenes I noticed that they added in rewrites that weren't really that much funnier than the scenes they were replacing. I mean, I guess they were trying to be, but I don't really know why they swapped them out, because occasionally I would be watching a scene and just think, this is almost as long as the original version, but we're missing out on so many character beats that could have saved the movie. But no, this was the thing that we needed to see. So I'm gonna start with the action in the Avengers, and I love how well integrated the story beats are into the action sequences. I liked how the whole team is in constant communication with each other. Cap kind of becomes the de facto leader and gives everyone instructions that utilizes their talents. And there are all these little moments where they check in with each other that serve as both breaks for the nonstop action and opportunities for some humor. My favorite shot in the whole movie is the CGI oneer, which essentially looks like a long tracking shot where we get to check in with every character. And then, in all of that, they still find time to have these great lines that are still popular references today.
And Hulk. Smash.
It just feels really artfully put together with a care that I honestly don't really recognize in a lot of other action movies. I get that Whedon maybe had a quarter of the time to plan everything out in Justice League version 1, but to contrast, we would be focusing on one character for a minute or two when they're fighting, and then something would happen where they lose their balance or got knocked down, and they would just kind of go, whoa, and be saved by another character at the last minute, and that was kind of all that we had in terms of teamwork. In version 2, I noticed that the characters were working together and communicating a lot more. I still don't think that they were able to fit quite as many memorable character moments or fun little bits of dialogue, but you know, oh well. It just felt like we were meant to be focusing more on the crazy CGI battle, which isn't necessarily worse if you're, unlike me, and more of a cool CGI and sick action person. One thing I've seen in like promotional interviews about Zack Snyder's movies, but also seems really clear throughout all of his films, is that he has a really spectacular way of visualizing action sequences. There are so many shots in his movies that are so cool. Like, just looking at them, you can see that someone had this image in their mind's eye from the beginning of the storyboarding process. It almost feels like he comes up with these shots as tent poles to build cool scenes around. And in those moments, it really feels like you're watching a film. In the Avengers, there were a couple shots that were really visually interesting and memorable, but I will be the first to admit that it doesn't happen nearly as much. And you can really tell the difference between the two Justice Leagues. For example, I noticed that in the Avengers, whenever Whedon wants to make something interesting, he just puts it in a Dutch angle. And you can pretty much tell from the beginning of his Justice League that he's back on his old shit immediately. And Snyder's version isn't perfect. Like, every time any Amazon does anything at all, they play the same theme.
You have the blood of the old gods in you.
That's not relevant to anything else I have to say. It just was so grating after 4 hours that I felt like I had to mention it. But for the most part, it's pretty cool. And if you are unlike me and sick action is your favorite part of any movie-going experience, I think that there's no way that you wouldn't enjoy this shit. But I do think Whedon, on the other hand, is a lot better at talking scenes, which makes a lot of sense because he got his start in TV, which is mostly talking. The Avengers get into this big argument on their floating ship, and you can really tell that he put a lot of thought into the choreography of both the actors and the camera. The camera moves from character to character, and you hear little snippets of what each character is saying, so you get a really quick sense for why they're not getting along. In Snyder's version of Justice League, the talking scenes are just not as fun. For instance, this one looks a little bit like a merry-go-round, and it's more focused on exposition rather than conflict between the characters. I'm pretty sure Whedon tried to fix this scene in rewrites and make it more like the fighting scene in the Avengers. The main argument is about whether or not they should have brought back Superman, Batman, just to be an asshole, I guess. brings up Wonder Woman's dead love interest, Steve Trevor, even though we're not even sure if he knows who Steve Trevor is, and it just makes him seem really childish. Neither feels especially earned. Bruce's outburst comes completely out of the blue, because it's never been set up that he's been particularly jealous of Steve Trevor, and he's never been in conflict with Diana before. And in the Avengers, the comparable argument is about S.H.I.E.L.D. preemptively making weapons to combat unknown threats. It's kind of an institution versus vigilante argument, which is a theme that's really present in a lot of superhero films. Cap and Tony almost come to blows as well, and we know that they haven't gotten along because they're opposites in a lot of really important ways. Cap thinks Tony doesn't take anything seriously enough, and Tony thinks Cap is stiff and overly righteous. From the absolute beginning of their interaction, as well as just knowing what we know about the characters, it's pretty easy to see that that fight was coming. In the Justice League, it feels like Whedon is just trying to recreate a scene from the Avengers that worked really well, but since the characters don't really have a reason to fight, they just kind of gutted a scene of some much needed exposition and put in some pointless arguing between characters that never really comes full circle in any way. And honestly, it feels like Whedon's kind of doing this a lot. Just wildly cutting and pasting things from the Avengers that worked and putting them in this other movie with a vastly different storytelling style, hoping that they'll have the same effect. Another example that kind of drove this theory home for me was the random ass Russian family that Whedon inserted into the middle of the final fight in his version of the Justice League. In Snyder's version, there were no civilians to worry about. Steppenwolf was just harvesting power from a nuclear plant in an abandoned radioactive town. He did the exact same thing in the Avengers, where he had Cap save a bunch of people from aliens in a subway station. And he was right to do it then because it did give the battle some necessary human stakes. And it also makes sense in the plot because most of the battle in the Avengers was about mitigating the damage that the aliens were doing to a city that already existed, not an abandoned nuclear town. And it also comes full circle at the end when there's an interview you see just for a little bit with one of the women that Cap saved. She essentially serves as a mouthpiece for all the thankful people who have seen the Avengers in action, know they're good people, and here to help and are on their side. And this is just another great example of why you can't just copy-paste things that worked in one movie into another movie, because the fight in Justice League isn't about mitigating damage. It's about stopping magic cubes from fusing together before they blow up and explode and destroy the entire world. And it felt like random civilians were just distracting from the vastly more important action that was happening with the other characters. But most importantly, it adds several minutes to the runtime of a movie where so many things needed to have been included, but were not. Again, it just feels like Whedon was trying to make the DC Avengers, but this movie was never gonna be the Avengers. He's just kind of smacking a lot of the same elements in there without really wondering if they'll work in a different scenario, and it leads to a lot of really strange inconsistencies in the plot and characterization. Okay, so before I get into the wrapping up section, I definitely need to touch on an admission. Joss Whedon was literally my favorite director, like all through middle school and high school. I've seen his shows Buffy and Dollhouse multiple times. Cabin in the Woods is one of my favorite movies. I watch it every October, and he's one of the creative voices that really inspired me to even take an interest in TV in the first place, which is why it literally breaks my heart that apparently he sucks so much. And Zack Snyder, from everything I've heard about him, is actually a really cool guy. And it is painfully obvious how weird Whedon is in his version of Justice League because it is full of whack shit. I feel like this was going around on the internet, but there's this insane shot where Wonder Woman falls on the Flash, and then Aquaman has that whole monologue about how hot Wonder Woman is.
You're gorgeous and fierce and strong and I know we went to war with the Amazons, but that was before my time. And you know what?
And then there's this shot that Whedon added in, which was just of Diana's ass. And then there's this whole bit where Cyborg won't fist bump Barry, and Barry has to make it about race when really he was just being annoying.
Well, we gotta stop him.
That's the plan.
That's the plan. Okay, we're not ready for racially charged.
So, knowing what we know now, I watched the Avengers on the lookout for some weird stuff because I honestly didn't notice anything when I watched it in the past. I mean, in fairness, I didn't notice anything in a lot of movies I used to watch a lot in the past, but this time I genuinely wanted to know if this was something that I literally was not seeing, or Whedon just pulled a J.K. Rowling and actively decided to be worse. So in terms of weird race stuff, the Avengers seemed colorblind, but really it was just because there was one POC character with lines and it's Fury. And Samuel L. Jackson is such a famous actor, and also Fury is everyone's boss, so I feel like Jackson was in a position where he could straight up refuse to say lines that he didn't want to. So I really don't know if there would have been any weird jokes had the Avengers had less white people in it. And the sexism, well, so Black Widow is the only woman on the team, and I know a lot of people have issues with her, but I honestly really like her character. Barring all of her other appearances, because I know her plot lines in Avengers Age of Ultron and Iron Man 2 are a little icky. I honestly didn't mind her so much here. I actually like her fighting style the best out of everyone. I think she's the quickest thinker, and I also think she's the most resourceful. I really liked when she's out of ideas, she just bites the person she's fighting. She's also the most adaptable. I think she's the only person to pick up an enemy's weapon and start fighting with it when she runs out of ammo. I honestly don't mind that she's kind of characterized as a sexy femme fatale spy. I like that she lets men relish in getting the better of her and then uses their confidence against them, because they always tell her exactly what she wants to hear when they're bragging about how much better than her they are.
We need you to come in.
Are you kidding? I'm working.
This takes precedence.
I'm in the middle of an interrogation. This moron is giving me everything.
I don't know. Maybe she's a little bit of a girl boss, but I liked her. My real issue with her is that she's the only lady on the team and also the only teammate that uses her sexuality. There are no like outwardly absurd Michael Bay-esque shots in the Avengers where it's like, okay, clearly you planned this to be leery and gross, but there's definitely enough weird stuff in there to see a through line to Justice League. And it just makes it so much more noticeable in Justice League because Wonder Woman is not like Black Widow at all. She doesn't ever use her feminine wiles to get the better of men. She's not flirty. Her whole thing is that she's one of the most powerful warriors to ever exist ever. So any references to how hot she is are just blatantly there for a male audience. And it's also just like 10 years have passed. It's time to stop planning our shot lists so we can stare at actresses. Also, I don't know, there are all these weird little comments Albert makes about Bruce needing to get laid. My honest guess is that Whedon was just in a rush to get this rewrite out with a bunch of jokes. So he's just kind of relying on like lazy, kind of gross humor to get him through the rewrites. And you know, the first jokes that came to his head were like, oh, girl fall on boy, funny, haha. And finally, although this could be a 3-hour video all on its own, I wanted to touch shortly about how all these movies go about trying to set up their franchises. First of all, I think I just need to circle back on how bad of an idea it was to try to make all of their characters super funny all of a sudden. If there's one thing that has to be consistent in a franchise where people pay money to see their faves fight in different contexts, it's the characterization. Not that Marvel has been like a perfect example of this. For example, I feel like Thor was acting really out of character throughout all of Avengers Endgame, and it was my biggest gripe with the whole movie. But I feel like they're pretty on point most of the time. Like, if you see Peter Parker in Captain America Civil War, and then you see an ad for Spider-Man Homecoming, you pretty much know what character you're paying to see a movie about. But now that Whedon has tried to Marvelize all of Snyder's characters, as someone with like $16 to spend on a movie, I know less about the characters and the movie that I'm gonna see. People keep coming back to Marvel movies because they love the characters, but if you don't really know what character you're paying to see, it's a lot harder to follow them and to care about their story. I feel like Marvel also had so much less work to do to set up their villain. We've already seen Loki's villain origin story, which means that we don't have to add any dragging exposition onto an already 2.5-hour long movie just to make Loki seem like less of a generically evil, greasy-haired man. So then, in comparison, when Steppenwolf was introduced into the Justice League, you know, Snyder had a fair amount of exposition where Steppenwolf was just trying to be Darkseid's best boy, which were helpful to understand Steppenwolf, but it also slowed the pace of the film. And then Whedon came and cut Darkseid entirely out of the movie because, you know, you don't technically need a villain's motivation to have a conflict and a resolution. But again, it just made Steppenwolf so generic, it was almost mind-boggling. But I also get that building to a Thanos-like world-ending villain in 3 movies instead of like 50 or whatever the fuck Marvel had is a lot harder. Basically, I meant to say that I think Marvel did a lot better job using their franchise to set up their big team-up movie. But then all the work that Snyder was able to do, they cut from the movie, and that's super unfortunate. And in terms of like sneak peek for future content, the first kind of most obvious change that I noticed Whedon made was that he added both a mid-credits plot scene and then a post-credits funny scene in true Marvel fashion. That's a format that everyone knows Marvel has been doing for like 15 years. Well, I think it's a really effective way to tease new characters and storylines for every nerd who's willing to sit through like 7 minutes of credits. It did strike me as odd that they would copy that format almost exactly. Basically, in all of Snyder's movies, the franchise bait either comes in somewhere in the middle of the film or after all of the main action has been resolved. And this is just my personal opinion, but I honestly don't think either work quite as well. Whether it's Batman having these crazy dreams that Superman is a bad guy now in Dawn of Justice, or his long-ass desert dream sequence at the end of Snyder's version of the Justice League, it just feels like a second story shoehorned into the story that I'm already watching. And believe me, I know that all of Marvel's post-credit scenes were just like blatant cash grabs and commercials for their next movies. Like, I know that we live in a society. Also, recently, I feel like in Marvel movies, there have been so many crossovers that every single new character is setting up a new show or movie, and it's gotten to the point where I think about watching new Marvel content and it just makes me tired. And you know, maybe I'm just noticing it because I'm more jaded now, but I feel like I prefer knowing that I'm choosing to watch a commercial when I technically don't have to, instead of feeling like I have to sit through a commercial to watch the story I already paid for. I just like the feeling that when you finish the Avengers, you felt like the story was over and the main villain had been defeated. And then you get a tease for Thanos right at the end. And I know this is like totally a lose-lose situation, because like, if not in the credits, where else are you gonna put your commercials for other movies? And the answer is, you know, I don't know. Maybe you just should have had an idea to have a cinematic universe 15 years ago, and then we wouldn't even be talking about this. And another thing that really surprised me about Snyder's version of the Justice League was how much villain and franchise exposition they really cut out. Because it really felt like Justice League had a lot of work to do. You know, setting up the biggest bad of all time, Darkseid, have I been saying it wrong the whole time? I don't know. And his hunt for anti-life, which is like an equation for universe-ending mind control. Cutting a lot of this stuff out because the studio is making you, I totally get. But cutting all of it out essentially felt like scrapping the entire next arc of DC's story. The post-credits scene in Joss Whedon's version wasn't even about Darkseid. It was about Lex Luthor getting a group of villains together to fight the heroes, which felt weird because I was like, if you're copying the Avengers in so many other ways and you already have a post-credits scene, just have the post-credits scene advertise your main universe-ending villain like the Avengers did with Thanos. Like, Darkseid didn't even have to talk. He just had to turn around and give the audience a cheeky smile. Because that was really all it took last time, and if you're copying so much else, why don't you just copy that too? And now, I feel like the whole plotline is gone, and with Zack Snyder stepping back from the universe, it feels like the DCEU is, like, kind of directionless. Okay, so, if I look more tired, it's because 6 months have passed since I started making this video. But, you know, since I have a job, occasionally, and that normally takes up most of my time, I had to sit on it until I was unemployed so that I could let the existential dread catch up to me before I really knuckled down and did it. So here I am. But also, I wanted to check back in because when I filmed this the first time, we didn't know that James Gunn would essentially be stepping in for Zack Snyder as the DC guy, which I think that after the mess Warner Brothers made of Justice League might be the only thing that can get everyone back on board with this kind of crazy franchise that almost died. After seeing his version of the Suicide Squad and Guardians of the Galaxy, I can tell he has a really specific, darkly comedic way of telling stories that are both really fun and absolutely heartbreaking. And I'm really excited to see what that vibe can do to DC's characters, which are already built as much more serious than Marvel's. Just like Marvel has such a specific vibe, and I think his recent projects also have a very specific vibe that I think will suit the universe really well. With everything that I said, I basically just hope to make it really clear that Justice League's excessive rewrites and what I read as trying to emulate the style of another franchise that worked really well totally ruined the Justice League that first time around. I still don't think Snyder's Justice League had to be 4 hours long, and I still do like the Avengers better, but I do think that if he released it at least holding true to his vision, I think it would have been a lot better received. Maybe it isn't the obscenely popular Marvel action comedies that everyone on Earth has seen, but it really did have its own thing going. It was mainly a drama with some sly humor, but then they gutted the whole movie and replaced all of that with just first draft jokes that had no reason to be there and were not funny. Avengers worked because it was always intended to be silly. As I was pointing out with Coulson's collectible playing cards, the plot was carefully structured so that funny moments could become meaningful character beats and vice versa. And trying to replicate that style when the foundation of the film was completely different, tonally, thematically, was just bad. It was bad. I definitely have a new appreciation for Snyder's movies. I will admit that when they were coming out, I did love to hate on them because I was a Marvel purist and I think that I was too harsh. Because Snyder updated the characters. He made them stoic heroes of great looking action movies. And anyone watching these films and not expecting to see a Marvel movie would have a pretty good time. Unfortunately, after all of this, I have not been swayed to be a bigger DC fan. I was raised on Marvel movies. My dad took me to see all of them as soon as they were released in the theaters, so I have a lot of good memories associated with that. And I'm also just personally drawn more to comedies. Especially, I find it a lot easier to buy into a story about a big green man that punches people or a boy that climbs up a building like a spider if it's on the sillier side, even if those movies end up being very serious at times. For me, if I'm watching a superhero movie, first and foremost, I want it to be fun. And the first decade of Marvel movies was largely exactly that. And even if most people didn't grow up watching Marvel movies like I did, I think that Marvel did a much better job of hooking people a lot earlier than DC even thought to. I just remember when I saw Endgame in theaters and Captain America picked up Thor's hammer for the first time, it was literally electric to me. Like, that was the magic sauce that Marvel was so good at making. And I remember everyone in the theater cheered because Captain America is a character that we had felt connected with for so long, and that was a moment we had been waiting for 10 years of real time. And I am not sure another theater going experience will ever beat that, at least for me. And that, unfortunately, is something that I'm just really not sure DC will ever be able to recreate. They were behind in setting up their franchise, and now that Henry Cavill is leaving, they're even more behind in fostering real connections with these characters that audience will pay to see again and again in theaters. And I knew that Darkseid was like the Thanos equivalent because he was trying to get this universe-ending power, but honestly, because I had so few, comparatively, movies to connect with the universe, I didn't really care. But I am hopeful to see what James Gunn will do with these characters. We know that he's really good at mixing action and comedy with much darker tones and themes, so he's a really good and maybe the only pick for the universe going forward. And although Marvel is still more popular, I think that a lot of people are feeling fatigue with the franchise, especially with Disney Plus and a new show coming out every other week and feeling like you can't keep up with it. So it might be a perfect opportunity for DC to swoop in and snag some of that goodwill that, frankly, I think Marvel is running pretty low on. And if they're really able to hook us really quickly and foster the same kind of connections with their characters, I think things could really be looking up for that universe. So all of that being said, I know I have a lot of opinions and I reserve the right to be wrong about all of them. And if the Warner Brothers are watching, my advice to you, gremlin though I am, would be to not try to change everything about a movie if principal photography has already happened. And also, even though CGI artists are magicians and they can make almost anything happen, they cannot change the tone of a movie and they cannot make an unfunny movie work. And also, if you are listening, I would love a job. Thank you.